How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. Today I'd like to give you a first look at one of my original playable minis from the Wild Imaginary West RPG. This is the Gunslinger. Today I'm going to be building a fully playable game board for the Wild Imaginary West and painting up my character in anticipation of the game's Kickstarter launch, which is in 2 days. And I am so excited for you guys to see it. I started the build with a gesso board and loosely sketched out the idea that I had for my game board. It's meant to be an homage to the first Wild Imaginary West video that I put on YouTube 3 years ago, although I have retconned some of the things from that video, like the astronauts. This game board is also going to double as a diorama, and like I mentioned, it needs to be playable. It's for a one-shot that I'm making, going to test on some friends of mine, so it did require a little bit of planning ahead. The idea that I have is just like that original diorama, to have an adit on the right side leading to a multi-level mine behind the hill. So I did the same thing that I've done with my previous mine videos. I cut out the shape of the mine on some vertical sheets of foam. I'm so used to building in 1 to 72nd scale that it's almost 72nd nature to me to build things in that scale. I had to make sure to keep checking my sizing regularly so that things didn't get too cramped. The joy of making terrain is actually what led me to make dioramas in the first place. It's kind of surreal to come full circle and now be building terrain for a game that I made based off my dioramas. After drilling 4 holes, I cut between them with a jigsaw to give me access to the inside of a hill so I can add some wiring and lights later on. And then it was time to start layering up some foam to create the hillside. Once all the levels of foam were stacked, I removed large chunks with my hot wire and then refined the shape even further with my Dremel. I was wearing a respirator and had my window open. I also used a vacuum cleaner to keep the dust at a minimum. After the dental work, I switched to a wire brush and I got rid of all of the little fibers that created using my heat gun. The next step was to protect the foam and fill all of the gaps using a terrain paste, and in this case, I used Sculptamold. When the foam has a lot of surface texture, I think using plaster paint and Mod Podge is a better way to go. But in this case, I had a lot of gaps to fill, so Sculptamold was a better choice for that. And once it was all on, I refined the shape with a wire brush. I did follow that up with a coat of plaster and Mod Podge. I forgot to add the paint this time, and then it was time to move on to the wooden details. I cut up some little sticks of balsa wood, and I used the same method that I've used in my previous mine videos. And in all of those, I used tricks that I learned from Luke Towan, from his gold mining video that he posted a few years ago. I added some extra details around the mine, like a wall of wooden planks near the opening, and then some vertical beams in the shaft, which I capped off because it's not an entrance. Realistically, I probably should have added more support to these tunnels, but because the walls are made out of foam, I'm not too concerned about them collapsing. It's also easier to move the minis between the larger gaps. I added a minecart shaft using some leftover HO scale track from my last train build. I made sure some of the ties were uneven to give it some character, and then I glued that in place. I added a couple ladders, and then finally I added the head frame to the top of the shaft, which will hoist things or players from one level to the next. After that, I threw some pebbles and sand against the back edge of the walls and sealed that with watered down white glue and isopropyl alcohol, and then it was time to build the walkway. My plan for this little layout is to have a multi-stage puzzle with different tasks that my players will have to do, all while anticipating and being prepared for an unknown monster attack, which could happen at any time. Another way I plan to use this map are with the player versus player gunfight rules. Rune Foundry did a great job of capturing the pace and playability of what I would liken to a tabletop wargame with the combat mechanics. So, if that's more of your thing, you can do that here as well. There was a piece of plastic I wanted to use from a clothing hanger of some kind, maybe socks. I don't remember, but it was made from a type of plastic that didn't want anything to stick to it. So I used a trick that I learned from the craftsman, which was to flame treat the surface, and after that, super glue would stick to it just fine. So shout out to Craftsman for that amazing tip. I made the upper platform for my outdoor lift, and then I cut away a chunk of the hillside to build my structure. Probably could have planned that a little bit better, but it wasn't too difficult to remove the section that I needed to. After that section had been cut out of the hill, I cut up some large flat pieces of balsa and began constructing the walls of the building. I'm not sure what kind of building this is supposed to be. I left the interior undecorated for now until I figured that out, but to complete the loop of the pathway around this game board, I added a flight of stairs to the inside of the building to get players to the top of the hill. Now the characters will be able to go in a full loop around this map, which would be helpful if they were running away from or trying to trap one big monster, but it may not be helpful if they're being attacked by a swarm of hungry bonecutter ants. I gave the structures some sheet metal roofs, and then I threw some Greeblies and cargo around the project. These will be able to be interacted with and may contain some awesome loot or cool items that the players can use. This lift, for instance, has two control panels, one at the top and one at the bottom, and one of them might not be working and require some work from the mechanic to function properly. I threw a winch for the outdoor lift where it needed to be, and then I put the lift box for the subterranean one in place as well. I then made both of the platforms that would be connected to said lifts. I added some string and I glued them both in place. The lift platforms were the last thing to add and the construction was done. After that, it was time to clean up my mat and get ready to paint. And while I paint this thing, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I put some black primer in my airbrush, and before moving on to the scenery, I decided to just go ahead and prime the Gunslinger, who I will be painting in a few minutes. I then jumped over to the scenery and began pre-shading, and then I started establishing the base colors, which, going back to boy-like classic style, are just different shades of brown. To give a little bit of life to the brown, I also threw on some blue, green, and red, which should show through a little bit, making it look like I didn't just use different shades of brown, but also different tones of brown. After adding a dusty sandy highlight, I gave the whole thing a coat of oil washes, using the same green, blue, and reddish hues to keep things lively. This was particularly important on the rocks. After the oils had dried, I dusted on some pigment powders using a rusty pigment for all the horizontal surfaces, which I sealed and locked in place by misting on some water. I then painted the final few standalone details with a brush, and the paint job on the board was mostly done. After wiping down my mat, I moved over to the Gunslinger. Along with the original minis, dice, and rulebook, the full boxed set will come with a campaign booklet to play through the established lore of the universe. But just like I'm doing here with this game board, the rulebook will also equip the GM, aka the Warden, to create unique campaigns or one-shots for their players, which will really help make the Wild Imaginary West their own. And if none of the pre-made minis that come with the box fit your specific character needs, you can always use minis from other places like Hero Forge. After the Gunslinger was painted up, I painted the rim of his base black, and he was ready to find some monsters. Then I moved back to the board and began installing the lights. As of the release of this video, the Kickstarter for the Wild Imaginary West RPG is launching in 2 days. That's September 10th at 8 in the morning, Mountain Time. I am so excited for you guys to see it. The first 200 people will have access to the early bird pricing for the full boxed set, and those pre-launch signups are still open, so make sure that you sign up for those to get reminded. This game is just the beginning of what I hope to do in the universe of the Wild Imaginary West, and none of it would be possible without you guys watching and enjoying these videos, so thank you very much for that. The last thing to do, of course, was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 4.0. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you on Tuesday.